Anatoly Biryakov was born on February 18, 1939, in the town of Chekhov, near Moscow. His father, Lieutenant General Nikolai Biryakov, was a prominent military figure, a participant in the Great Patriotic War, and a hero of the Soviet Union. He raised his son with strictness and dreamed of making him a real man. Anatoly was interested in weapons from childhood, and at the age of 8 managed to get to his father's box of cartridges. He knew that gunpowder was inside the cartridges, which could be used to make lapushki, a favorite toy of children from the military generation. To get it, the boy began sawing the cartridge with a saw, and at some point, the spark exploded, injuring him. As a result, Anatoly Biryakov's face was left with ugly and deep scars for the rest of his life. He explained to others that he supposedly tipped a pot of boiling water on himself in childhood, but the scars greatly changed Biryakov's life, and the neighborhood kids started to ridicule him. Eventually, he became withdrawn, stopped playing in the yard, and tried not to go outside unnecessarily. Nevertheless, he studied well in school, was loved by his teachers, and was a man of his word among his few acquaintances. After school, Biryakov decided not to follow in his father's footsteps. Instead, he became a trained locksmith and started working at one of the capital's construction sites. Anatoly's father was not thrilled with his choice, but he was proud that his son was valued at work for his responsibility and professionalism. Despite his insecurities about his appearance, Biryakov successfully married, and one after another, his chosen ones gave birth to their daughter. However, there were problems in the couple's intimate life, and it was precisely this that later made Anatoly explain his perverted passion for infants that unexpectedly awakened in him. One of his daughters could have become a victim of the maniac, but Biryakov was afraid of exposure and did not harm her. Instead, he began to kidnap and use other people's infants for his own satisfaction. The first crime committed by the maniac occurred in 1971. Biryakov was walking home from work and passed by a children's clinic where he noticed a baby carriage with a screaming infant inside. The mother had stepped away for a minute, and when she came out of the clinic, she was horrified to see a stranger pushing the carriage with her child further and further away. The mother immediately raised the alarm, and bystanders gathered and detained Biryakov while calling the police. Biryakov, who was arrested and taken to the police station, tried to convince the officers that he had just made a bad joke and stole the carriage to teach the negligent mother a lesson for leaving her child on the street. This time, the Soviet hero's son was believed and fined for his self-initiative and released home. However, in 1972, Biryakov attempted to kidnap a baby again, but fortunately, he was unable to carry out his plan to the end. He was apprehended before he could escape with the child, and an investigation began. Sadly, no one realized at the time that Biryakov's goal was specifically to kidnap a baby. Biryakov was able to convince investigators that he intended to steal and sell the carriage and did not notice the baby inside. According to some reports, Biryakov received a 3-year prison sentence for theft, but he somehow managed to escape from prison. Regardless, after these events, Anatoly's family fell apart, and his wife decided not to continue her life with a criminal and filed for divorce. These events had an impact on Biryakov, and for several years, he suppressed his sick fantasies, worked, and led a normal life. However, in the fall of 1977, his inner demon resurfaced. While walking in Moscow, Biryakov came across a baby carriage with a 3-month-old girl on Marshal Berezov Street. Her mother was not around, either having gone into the building where the children's kitchen was located or having met friends and wandered away, carelessly leaving the child unattended. Biryakov took advantage of this and grabbed the carriage, brought it to the nearest yard, took out the baby, and went into a stairwell, climbing to the landing between the 3rd and 4th floors. There, the maniac placed the girl on the windowsill and unwrapped her. She began to cry, but then a door slammed on one of the floors, and Biryakov, frightened, grabbed a knife he had used to sharpen pencils at work and plunged it into the little girl. She fell silent, and the maniac ran away. The body of a child who died was found accidentally. One person saw him, the building superintendent, during a routine inspection of the entrances. Another woman who lived in the building and went for a walk with her children also saw him. An investigation began immediately. At first, detectives assumed that the dead girl was from a marginalized family, and her own parents had disposed of her, but several facts spoke against this version. The murdered infant was not emaciated. It was well taken care of during its life, and its swaddling clothes and clothing were new and of good quality. However, when operatives found the grieving mother of the dead girl, she was not immediately excluded from the list of suspects. The murder in Moscow was reported to the head of the USSR Ministry of Internal Affairs, Nikolai Shelikov, who immediately ordered the case to be classified and prevented the leakage of information to the press. However, as time showed, this step was erroneous. Muscovites continued to leave strollers with their children unattended, which the maniac Biryakov took advantage of. Just 3 days after his first murder on September 19, 1977, Biryakov kidnapped another 3-month-old girl. The baby's mother went shopping at the Children's World store on Prospect Mira, leaving the stroller with the sleeping child at the store's door. The maniac pulled the baby out of the stroller and ran away. They searched for the girl throughout Moscow, inspecting construction sites, wells, and abandoned buildings. Her parents hoped until the end that the kidnapper had taken the baby to another city. But a month later, the child's body was found on one of the city's dumps. Investigators quickly realized that the 2 infant murders in Moscow were the work of one maniac. They assumed that the killer was most likely previously convicted of crimes against minors or suffered from a mental illness. Detectives reviewed archives and interrogated many suspects who fit these criteria. However, they did not find the killer among them. Meanwhile, while the investigation was going in the wrong direction, Biryakov kidnapped a 6-month-old boy in October 1977. The boy's mother left her son next to the entrance, in the arms of an elderly neighbor, and quickly went home herself. The maniac unexpectedly attacked the pensioner, snatched the baby from her arms, and ran away. The woman called for help, but by the time passers-by arrived, the criminal was already far away. The boy's body was found a few days later, and by that time, detectives had already compiled a list of features of the baby hunter, which is what the Muscovites called the maniac. When he abducted babies, the maniac always wore a cap over his eyes. Once, the police decided to check a young father who was holding a baby and waiting for a bus at a bus stop. He turned out to be innocent, but Biryakov, who happened to be nearby, became a witness to the check. As a result, the maniac realized that he was being hunted and decided to commit his new crimes not in Moscow, but in his hometown of Chekhov. Soon, the residents of the Moscow suburb learned terrible news that someone had kidnapped 2 girls who were not even a year old, and after some time their bodies were found. The investigation headquarters for the baby hunter case moved to Chekhov, but initially the search for the maniac was unsuccessful. On October 21st, Biryakov went hunting again. He went to the outskirts of Chekhov, near a grocery store, and noticed a lonely stroller. Looking around and realizing that there were no adults nearby, Biryakov took out the sleeping 4-month-old girl and tried to escape. But he didn't take into account one thing: the baby's mother was watching the stroller through the store window, and when she saw Biryakov grab her daughter, she dropped her groceries, ran out onto the street, and began calling for help. Her cry was heard by several passers-by who chased after the maniac. Realizing that he couldn't get far with the baby in his arms, he threw her onto the pavement. Fortunately, the child was unharmed, and the pursuit of Biryakov continued. He ran through courtyards until he finally reached the forest, where he managed to hide. However, during his escape, the maniac lost his cap, so the pursuers were able to see and remember his facial features. A detailed photo fit of the criminal was compiled the same day, and the search for him began in the capital region. At some point, the detectives came to check the Moscow construction plant where Anatoly Biryakov worked. The company's employees were horrified to see their colleague in the photo fit, and they said that he was modest and hardworking. The baby hunter was arrested on the same day in his own home. He did not deny his guilt and sadistically told the detectives how he tortured his victims. Biryakov committed all 5 of his murders in just 1 month and claimed that he allegedly killed the first victim out of fear in the stairwell, fearing that he would be identified. Only when Biryakov found himself on the street did he realize that an infant could not be a valuable witness for the investigation. Meanwhile, the maniac's openness was simply explained: he was convinced that his father would redeem him, and there would be no severe punishment. Nikolai Biryakov initially refused to believe that his only son had become a monster and hired Anatoly, one of the best and most experienced lawyers. But after several court hearings in which the prosecution presented their arguments, Nikolai Biryakov publicly disowned his son. The maniac father could not recover from the blow and survived Anatoly by only 2 years. The expensive lawyer could not help the baby hunter, either, as the court's sentence was death by execution. This was quite expected since by that time, specialists from the Serbian Institute had recognized Anatoly Biryakov as sane, albeit with pedophilia, a mental disorder characterized by sexual attraction to infants. After the sentence, the maniac attempted suicide several times, and then began writing petitions for clemency to various authorities, including the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. They were all rejected, and Anatoly Biryakov's last day of life was February 24, 1979. He barely had time to celebrate his 40th birthday in isolation before the executioner's bullet struck the maniac.